Hello, welcome to Chapter 9, Section 2, Characteristics of Quadratic Functions. In this section, we are going to be talking about graphs of quadratic functions, which are called parabolas. So if you see the word parabola, like find the vertex of the parabola, that kind of stuff, that's what it means. All of these graphs right here, while I'm talking, you can look at them. All these graphs right here that are in red are graphs of quadratic functions, and the shape that it makes is called a parabola. And we talked about that a little bit in the video for the last class. In this section, we're going to be talking about characteristics. A characteristic is something that describes an object or a person. If we're talking about a person, you can say, a characteristic would be like what color eyes that they have, what color hair that they have, how tall they are, all these things that kind of describe them. So you would be able to use these words to narrow down and identify like a person. If I was like, hey, I saw this person and had blue eyes and was wearing a purple shirt and had spiked green hair. I don't know. These would be characteristics of a person, and it would help you so that we would communicate, we know what we're talking about. Now, we're not talking about people, obviously. We're talking about quadratic functions. So there's certain characteristics, and the big ones are going to be where the vertex is, so like where it changes direction, what we call the axis of symmetry, and that'll be in the next video, so we'll talk about that. And other things like where its y-intercept is, like where it crosses the y-axis. So this one crosses here at -2. This one also crosses at -2, but these two are not the same. So even though they can have a shared characteristic, that doesn't mean that they're going to be exactly the same. It's all of the characteristics together that make these parabolas unique. Okay, in this first video, we're going to be talking about one of those characteristics called the zeros. The zeros are where, so if we write it as y equals, it's where y equals 0. Or if we write it as f of x, it's where f of x equals 0. So it's where the function is going to equal 0. And this is going to get us toward later in the chapter where we're going to transition into quadratic equations. So I would replace this y with a 0. So I'm actually finding the intersection between this function and the function y equals 0. And then that becomes an equation that I can solve. And that'll be the last 5 sections of chapter 9, like starting at like 9.5, 9.6, 9.7, 9.8, 9.9. So that'll be very, very important, and it leads us toward more advanced math, and I'm saying too much already. This right here, y equals 0, this is what we call the x-axis. So on the x-axis, all of the y values are 0. So this is the equation of the x-axis. So when we find the zeros from the graph, all we're going to do is find out where the graph crosses the x-axis. That's it. And later, this will become a little bit more complicated, as always. But for now, it's not going to be too difficult, or it should not. If it's difficult, it's because I'm not explaining it correctly. All right? So there's not any work that I have to do. I don't have to do any calculations. All I got to do is look at the graph. So let's look at this first one. I have y equals x squared subtract x subtract 2. This has already been graphed for you. So we're going to find the zeros from the graph. And all I have to do is look. I already got them like printed off in red. I stole these from the book. But I'm just going to put a little dot here so you can see where they are. And this is one of the zeros. And this is another 0. That's where it crosses. This thicker horizontal line right here is the x-axis. So where the red graph, or the graph drawn in red, crosses the x-axis is here and here. Now, for the zeros, all I need you to do is tell me what the numbers are. So where does this cross the x-axis? It crosses at -1 and at +2. I'll even put the plus sign in front of the 2 so that you can see that it's positive. Of course, you don't have to do that. It's just the hidden part. Now, I will say this. Most of the time when we do it, we actually write it like this: x equals -1 and x equals +2. That's perfectly okay, and that's usually the way we're going to do it most of the time, especially when we get into treating this as an equation to solve, where the solutions to the equation are the same as the zeros of the function. There's a huge overlap there, and we'll be getting into that. But don't stress out about it right now. When I find the zeros, I'm just looking for numbers. In the next video, I'm going to make a distinction between that and something else. So this graph crossed 2 times, so I got 2 zeros. This graph, the vertex is on the x-axis. So basically what happens is this one, the graph goes up, 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 up. It touches the x-axis at the vertex and then turns around and comes back down. So I know we talked about maximum and minimum in the last section, so that's kind of the idea here. So what's the 0 right here? It looks like my 0 is +1. You can also write x equals +1 if you want to write it as x equals. For the last one, here's my x-axis. Here's my quadratic function, the parabola that represents the graph, my quadratic function. And this time, there's a little bit of a gap here. This graph is too far above the x-axis for it to actually intersect the x-axis. So what I can say here is there are no real zeros. Now, of course, by saying it that way, it kind of implies there's zeros that are not real. And that is one of the major ideas that we actually talk about in Algebra 2. I'll introduce it in this class, but it's not something that you have to worry about. There's actually there are zeros for this graph, but they're not numbers that make sense. So we'll save that for a little bit later. Okay, so that's it. That's all you gotta do. Look at the graph and just tell me where it crosses the x-axis. Sometimes it can cross twice. Give me both numbers, -1 and 2. Sometimes the vertex touches the x-axis, so there's only 1 0. And sometimes it doesn't cross at all, and you can just simply say, at this point, there are no real zeros. All right, we'll see you in the next video.